Hello, everyone. My name is Derek Cameron. I work on the Code Innovate team. Today, I'm going to cover database access using IAM credentials and the use of security policies to provide fine-grained access to data in the databases. You can access this either through OAC or any other third-party tool, and these security policies that we set up will be enforced across all the tools, and including direct database access. Support for IAM credentials is very new to Oracle. Historically, we've been able to create security policies on tables, but that meant using database user IDs, which typically aren't used through tools such as OAC. And so I'm really excited to show you how we can now secure the data in the database, but still use tools like OAC, Oracle Analytics Cloud, with your IAM account, access that data in the database, but secured at the row level. Every user has their own access policy. Each user sees different data based on who they are and what their role is. So let me get started. So I'll talk about how to set up and enable IAM authentication in the database, and then show you how you need to map your local groups with your federated groups and map those to database schemas in the database. I'll show you how to set up security policies, that's row level access on tables that enable different access for different IAM users, and to use security context to set access levels and improve performance. Lastly, I'll show you how to access that data with OAC using the IAM credentials, and how to initialize the security policies as part of the login process. Now, typically, developers access multiple databases and are granted access through database schemas, each with their own user ID and password, and they log in with those credentials using a variety of tools. You might be using SQLDeveloper, SQL+, Toad, any number of tools. Privileges are usually granted through database roles. Analytics tools such as OAC also access data as well, with connections using typically a shared schema, which has its own user ID password, and that has privileged access to all rows and all data. Users log into OAC with IAM credentials, but ultimately OAC relies on credentials and data source connections for data access. And OAC developers create data sets for end users. Sometimes those are filtered based on the need to restrict access based on end user roles. And every client and analytic tool needs to separately configure appropriate data access to end users. So how is this all changing with IAM and use of security policies? We can now configure support for IAM users and IAM groups, local and federated. IAM users can define their own database passwords independent of their IAM password. So the IAM password policies will not clash with database password policies. And users can further create user aliases, simplifying the name if it's long with federated, the federated naming component. It means that a developer can use a single IAM user ID and IAM database password to access all their databases. With IAM authentication, the use of DBMS RLS, row level security, which has been around for a great many years, has now become a very attractive feature for securing data across all third-party tools, PaaS applications, and database client tools. So let's get started. So now let's look at IAM authentication setup for the database. I'm going to go into identity and security. I'm going to go into federation. We're going to federation. And I've got two users I want to look at setting up. This user here, I'm going to use later on in Oracle Analytics Cloud, and I'll explain more about that later. I've also got my own user, which I use every day, derek.cameron@oracle.com. And so I set that user up as well. Now I also set up a federated group. Let's take a look at that. The federated group that I created is this one here, DGC ADW users. Now you can map a database schema to an individual user. I chose to create a new IAM federated group and then add my federated users to the federated group. I will point something else out, though, is that the database can't see the federated groups. It can only see the OCI groups. And so you've got groups in the OCI side, non-federated, and you've got groups in the federated side. And so I created a new group on the local setup. It's called, and now they're the same name, but they're in fact different groups. One's an OCI group, one's a federated group. The federated users are tied to the federated group. And then the last thing is you've got this group mapping. So I've mapped the DGC ADW federated group with the non-federated user account. So that's an important point to make. So now I have the federated users. Let's go back into identity. They do show up here on the local side. These are local users. These are federated users. You can see that because, of course, they're prefaced with the identity provider. And so if I click on this new user that you'll notice there's now database passwords. And so let's go into database passwords, and you'll see I've created a new one here. Now, this password can be different from your IAM password, but you may have and probably do have different policies for your database than you do for your tenancy. And so you may not even have control over that. And so, you can make this the same, but at some point your database policies may force a password change. So you'll probably end up maintaining separate passwords here, but this is required in any case. Whether or not it's the same as your IAM one is beside the point. The other important thing I'll point out is that this username here, you can make it anything you want. You can change it here. So if you have schema demo mapped to a nice short alias called Derek, that works. I will caution you on that because when we go into OAC and we start passing through your identity through to security policies, you'll need to have that name the same. So if you're not using a tool and you want convenience, you want a nice short name, you can log into the database with some alias, and that is convenient, but we'll see later why I would advise against that. So there's the database user ID. And then the other thing to make this work is to go on the database side, and you're going to execute this here, execute DBMS Cloud Admin, enable external authentication, and it's IAM. To disable it, you've got this here. Now, I'll point something out here. I had an issue after I'd made a lot of changes to clean this up for this presentation, and I just couldn't get in with my users, and it really stymied me. And finally, I just disabled it and re-enabled it. Now, I don't know really what goes on when you enable the authentication here, but that fixed it. I'm just pointing that out. I don't think you should have to do that, but with all the changes I made, I ended up having to do that. So the other thing is you need to map the user to a to a schema in the database. These are the schemas that you always, that you're typically work with normally. And you say you can create a new user, and you can say identify globally as, and then you have the IAM group name. Remember, I showed you that in the tenancy there, DGC ADW users. You can alter an existing user. So the existing user's demo, that user's been around on my demo side for some time now. I altered it and I set it to IAM authentication. Once you do that, you can't log in as demo, the schema users after that. And if you want to revert to logging in with that demo schema, you do an alter user identified by, and then just use a password. So that's how to toggle it back. And if you're troubleshooting like I was, you'll probably flip these back and forth a few times. So once you've done this, you've now this schema that I've got here. Let's look at it, properties. This is the demo schema. It's got the password. And this will not work right now because I've already executed IAM authentication. But this will. This is an IAM user. It's my shared user I'll be using in OAC. And this is my other user, which is my end user writing reports in OAC. So if you open up one of these, you'll see here, it's ADW demo user. That is not a database user. That is an IAM user. And this password is the same as that password I set in the database password field. It's not the IAM password. So you could have two different passwords. Remember, it's your tenancy password login versus your database password configured in OCI. So let's do that. So when I connect to this, since it's mapped to the demo schema, I am going to see the same tables that I would otherwise have seen in, as logging in as a demo user. So here it is here. There's all this. And so that's how that works. And I can log in with Derek.Cameron or any other user in that's mapped to that group, that's mapped to this IAM group, as long as they've set their database password. They have to do that in IAM. Now we're going to go on to set row level security now with these IAM users. But at this point, you can now log in and use IAM users with the database. So now that we have configured IAM authentication against the Oracle database, what can we do with it? Well, one very useful use case would be to configure row level security so that whether you're logging into the database using, say, SQLDeveloper, or you're logging in through Oracle Analytics Cloud or some other tool, that the security policies that are applied to the tables will consistently be used in queries that access that data. And so I'll show you how to set that up. We'll start by creating a security context. Now, what are security contexts? They're really just allow you to define variables in memory and set those variables or change and retrieve those variables in memory. And they're often used with VPD or virtual private database, that is row level security. They're often used as part of the filter in the where clause. They're strictly speaking not needed if you were to look up VPD or row level security with the use of DBMS RLS, which we'll be using. You'll see system context, but in fact, they're not strictly speaking required. We're going to use context though. They're very fast, they're in memory, and very convenient to use. So we're going to use them. It's best practices as well to do that. So we'll start by creating a demo security package. It's got two components, two procedures. One is setting the security, and the other is setting who you are. Now you might say, well, why do I need to know that? You've got the system works context called user-env, and it has your authenticated identity. But if you log in with OAC, you're going to need to use a shared login. Although the user variable is available to you in OAC, the password isn't. The password isn't, so that's really what defeats that. So we need to set that context separately. We do it with a login trigger when we log into the database, and we reference that system context user environment variable. But when we go into Oracle Analytics Cloud in the RPD, we're going to call a procedure to set it differently. We're going to use the user variable that's logged into OAC. So you'll see how that works. So we create the package and we create a procedure. Now you see here, I'm setting it explicitly. I'm going to set the location, the country ID to UK and US as a filter. And I've also defined, I defined for the user security context, a variable called user ID. I'm going to pass in that, so that'll persist, and I'll be referencing that later when the policy is applied. So there's that. We're going to create the context itself called demo security. That's this context up here. That's called demo security. That's this here. And we're going to grant execute on this package, right? Because this is all being done with the admin user ID. And so you need to be able to execute it as an end user. So you're going to I grant that to public. Now, so once I do that, I can set the security here, and this is just for test purposes. Typically, we're going to do this with a login trigger when we set up the login process, we'll use a trigger, but just to test it, you can just execute it directly there. And then if you just want to test it, you go here, and I'm going to go to the user that I've logged in here, and you'll see how that works. There it is there, UK, US. So let's go back to admin. That tells us that our context is right. I've just provided a little bit of code here. So I've explicitly set them up here, but you might want to do, you might want to build this in list using a query. And so just for your convenience, I've looped through the locations table here, and I built that in list for you. You can use this code. I'll post this code on the YouTube channel. So, and then the predicate function. So what function is called to build that where clause? It's right here. We need a function. And the function says that if the user that I've logged in with, that is not the user environment system variable, but the one that I set either through OAC or through a login trigger, if it's not the ADW demo user, then set the context with the, in our case above, it's set to US and UK, or else just predicate. I need a predicate, so it's just 1 = 1, so there's 0 overhead. Now recall that we're using the ADW demo user as the OAC shared user, but everybody else, like myself here, I'm going to be logging into OAC or any other tool as Derek Todd Cameron. So just be clear, one's an end user, the other is the shared user that'll be used in the connection pool in OAC. So it's going to return a predicate, and then I'm going to add the policy. Actually, that's a little misleading either as well, because you're actually creating the policy. That policy name, you don't create it somewhere else. It's created right here, even though it says add policy. The object schema, I'm going against the demo schema. The table is locations. I'm setting it on that. The policy name, I'm giving it. And the function schema, the owner of all the functions is admin. The policy function is right here. It's apply demo policy FN. And the interesting thing is that you can apply it differently, different policies on different DML operations. So it could be on delete, insert, update, in this case, select. So you've got finer control than just simply a policy on a table. You can base it on different DML actions. And if you need to drop it, there it is there. Simple, drop the policy there, policy name. And here's our login trigger. This is going to be used for database login, right? For SQLDeveloper or SQL Plus or anything like that. You've got admin.demosecurity context, set the policy security, and then set who I am. And here's where you're looking at, I'm showing you the system variable. This is available to everybody as a user environment. I'll show you a few others as well that are kind of useful, like the OSID user ID is available as well. So I'm going to set my system variable, my system context using the logged in system one. I'll be using a different procedure for OAC. And so then you want to test it, go select star from demo locations. I will point out if you just click in SQLDeveloper on the table, you'll get an Aura SCN error because it expects that you might want to update the table. So it doesn't actually work. You need to do, say, select star from locations. That's this one here. So the admin user should be able to see everything. That's that. And the Derek user should only be able to see US and UK. Let's look at that. And so yes, US, UK, there's that ubiquitous filter that's getting applied directly on the table, regardless of how the user comes in, what tool they're using, or whether in fact they're even using a PAS or other tool. So let's go back here. And so this is the database login. What about the RPD? Well, the RPD, I need to pass the OAC user ID, and I'm going to pass that in the RPD by calling this procedure. I'll show you how to do that. You're just going to use it, execute on connect, and it's going to set the context. So then when we're all done, you're going to see consistent filtering both through OAC and through the database. So you've seen it here. So now I'll be switching over to the RPD in OAC and show you how to configure that. There's just one more thing I forgot to show you. So once you've configured IAM, there are some system variables you have access to, things like the current user, and understand that I'm logged in with the IAM user, but you can still access and find out who is the underlying mapped database user. And then the authenticated identity. There it is there, Oracle Identity Cloud Service Derek Cameron, and then enterprise, the OSID user ID. So you can see there that it's the cloud user ID that you're familiar with if you've been working on OCI. The authentication method is password global, network protocol TCPS, and identification type is global shared. So yeah, those are useful variables you might want to use at some point. So let's look how this can be set up in OAC. So whether you're using direct connections in data visualization or whether you're using an RPD in the classic mode, you're going to be using a shared user ID. So if you look at this user here, let's go back. If you look at this user here, I go to inspect, and you'll notice its username is demo. So, you know, if I put in my IAM user ID, that would be fine for just me, but you can't have really realistically a connection for every person. So you're going to have a shared connection, and you're going to have to pass or set the context for that shared connection to be the logged in user ID. I'm not sure how to do that in data visualization, but if we go over to Classic in the RPD, we do have a lot more control. So we have this notion of a connection pool. Connection pools, I won't go into data modeling in OAC. It's a fairly comprehensive topic, but very briefly, for the purposes of just showing this particular configuration for IAM users, let's open up the connection pool. And there's a few things I want to show you. First of all, I'm going to be logging in with the shared user ID. Remember, we've been using this ADW demo user and the password. This could be a dynamic field, but the password can't. So that kind of means that we have to go with the demo user. And if we go into connection pools, we've got a connect on, an execute on connect, and it's pretty simple. It's just begin admin.security init PRC pass my logged in user ID through to the connection. So that's kind of the glue that holds it together. This procedure I wrote, and it was for the login for OAC. Remember, we're using a trigger for the database, and we're using this procedure for the login. So that's really just about it. There's just one other thing I want to show. If you open up here and we go under general, you notice there's a checkbox for virtual private database, and you can think, well, what is that for? So when you create reports in OAC, these reports are cached. It's a great feature. If anybody runs a particular report, in the absence of VPD, if anybody runs a report, anybody else can use that cached content, and rather than going back to the database and re-executing the query. And that's great, but if you have every user accessing different rows for exactly the same query, that kind of defeats the security. So when you check the virtual private database, what the BI server does is create user specific cache. So then every user has their own cache, and users don't borrow or use cache from other users, which would defeat the whole row level security configuration. So that's what that's all about. So now we can go and take a quick look at the reports. So if I go back here and I go to home, I'm going to create a new user, a new report. I'm going to create, and we can create a DV report. We can still access the RPD content through a DV interface. So I'm going to say workbook. And then I'm going to go to subject areas. I'm going to go to demo. This is the RPD work subject area in demo. And this is just a very, very simple example. I didn't want to complicate it. So if we go to country ID, and I'm Derek.Cameron, right? And so I have access to UK and US, and you'll see it there. And if you log in with the ADM user, the ADM is shared user, you'll see all of the users and countries. So I hope you found this useful. Go ahead and explore, and good luck.